Welcome to History 1302, the Transportation Revolution, focusing primarily today on the railroad and the growth of the American economy in the Gilded Age. In the period after the Civil War, the period 1865 onward, the nation experienced incredible growth, bursting, if you will, from a frontier economy to a global economy. And one of the things that made that happen, made that transition possible outside of the war itself, was the transportation revolution and the railroad. Some of the statistics that historians have talked about from 1869 to 1899, so that 30 years following the end of the Civil War, the United States population tripled. And that's a phenomenal figure considering the losses of the Civil War, the tens of thousands of men killed on battlefields and by diseases, the destruction of the civilian population across the South. To have the population triple, and a lot of that isn't just natural growth, it's immigration from both China and from Europe. But in addition to the nation's population tripling, the farm production of the nation more than doubled. So we're producing not only enough food to feed the populace, but to export food as well. Where in this time period, nations like England are still struggling to feed their people, the United States has more than enough to spare. And in that same time frame, while the nation's population is growing and the food supply is growing, American manufacturing increased over six-fold. Six-fold. Clear indication that the Industrial Revolution is here. Unleashed by the war, for sure. Within 60 years of the end of the Civil War, the nation became the preeminent world economy. Before the Civil War, the United States probably ranked somewhere around 5th or 6th. As far as world economies and military power, they were even lower than that. After the Civil War, arguably in 1865, the nation's in the top 5 military, but the economic and the industrial production quickly catch up. So that by the time of World War I, 1914, the United States is teetering on the brink of being the dominant world economy, and certainly outstripping all other nations in the only indices that mattered of the day, steel production. In addition to all these changes, the United States is becoming an urban nation, leaving the rural roots of its past, becoming an urban nation of city dwellers. And that nation of city dwellers is driven by one thought: mass consumption. Mass consumption. The need for goods and services to survive. Out in the country, people take care of themselves. In the city, they have to rely on those goods and services being there for them. And the railroad is what makes that possible. Bigness began to emerge as a way of life in America, and nothing exemplified that more than the railroad. So while historians may argue that whether the Civil War unleashed the economic might of the nation, it's almost self-evident that after the emergence of the nation from the war in 1865, they began looking toward and seeking that ultimate goal that had been established with Christopher Columbus. Remember in 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue? Remember what he was seeking? He was seeking the riches of the Orient. The railroad is the next step in making that possible. Columbus couldn't find the Orient, couldn't make it to China because there's continents in the way. The railroad bridges that gap. And in the next section, as we move on in this semester, we're going to get to the growth of the United States into an imperial power. That has to follow the invention of the railroad. It has to follow the creation of the railroad and a standardized economy. And we begin here with the Civil War. In 1862, in the midst of the war, the United States passed a piece of legislation that the federal government had wanted, and especially northern states had wanted, from almost the beginnings of the Republic, but certainly after 1840 and the advent of the railroad. The United States desperately needed the creation of a transcontinental railroad. A railroad to bridge east and west. In fact, you can argue that the creation of a transcontinental railroad is one of the issues that caused the war. The Southerners wanted a southern route for that railroad. Northerners wanted a northern route for that railroad. The compromise was a middle ground through Kansas and Nebraska, and that separating of Kansas and Nebraska leading to Bleeding Kansas and the origins of the conflict that explodes into war. Southern opposition to the creation of a Pacific Railroad was in place until the South left. In 1861, with the secession of the South and the removal of the Southern obstacle, the Republicans in Congress passed a number of acts, banking reform, currency reform, land reform, but one of the key pieces of legislation that they passed was the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862. Or if you prefer, you can go the long title that I've put on the slide, an act to aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line from the Missouri River to the Pacific Ocean and to secure to the government the use of the same for postal, military, and other purposes. We tend to go with Pacific Railroad Act just because it's easier. But in that piece of legislation, it decrees that money and land should be set aside for the construction of a transcontinental railroad. The initial phases of that railroad were begun during the war, but because of the needs of railroad construction in the East, the construction of more railroads to facilitate Union victory in the war, and then as the North moved through the South and destroyed Southern railroads, they needed to rebuild the infrastructure to facilitate the further conquest of the South. All of the rails and the equipment were diverted from the construction of the Pacific Railroad to the East and the rebuilding and further construction of the infrastructure. So it's not until the war is over that the Pacific Railroad Act is really implemented. And beginning shortly thereafter, as you can see on this slide, 2 railroad lines were chartered to construct the Transcontinental Railroad. Originating from the west and proceeding east would be the Central Pacific Railroad. Starting in Sacramento, California, it was to go as far eastward as it could, and then beginning in the east, headed west, would be the Union Pacific, originating in Sioux Falls, but that line is going to be completed even after the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. So the real origin of the Union Pacific for most of its early life is going to be Omaha, Nebraska. And so they begin in Omaha, they begin in Sacramento, and they work toward each other. Constructing rail lines across the prairie or in the mountains, it was too expensive, too exorbitant for any one company or 2 companies or 10 companies to pay for out of their own pocket. And so the federal government made it possible through the Pacific Railroad Act for companies to get cash loans dependent on the amount of mileage of track that they construct and land grants for the railroads to use, selling that land to generate revenue for the further construction westward of the railroad. Now, some of you may be familiar with the popular series on A&E, Hell on Wheels, which is an ironic choice of title. Hell on Wheels could mean the railroad, but in fact it really doesn't. That's not why they chose the name. Hell on Wheels are the communities that grew up around the camps building the railroad. And in one of those episodes, early episodes, focusing on the Union Pacific and their construction, there was no incentive for them to build a straight line across the frontier. The more miles you constructed, the more money you got from the federal government. So the Union Pacific quite often built curved lines to maximize the mileage as they crossed the prairies, and thus getting more money and more loans and more land from the federal government. Now the land was divided up into 10 miles on each side of the railroad in checkerboard fashion, with the railroad getting one section, the federal government holding on to the other sections, and they could then sell that land to settlers, to the miners, to whomever, to generate the money they needed for construction. As you can see from the slide, the two railroads moved toward each other beginning in January of 1863 on the Central Pacific, July of 1865 in the Union Pacific. And by the way, the Central Pacific could start earlier because the supplies out west, it was too exorbitant to ship that to the east for use in the war effort, so they got a little bit earlier start. But the two going toward each other, and because of the land, the easy route that the Union Pacific had at first, you can see they constructed 1,087 miles of track, whereas the Central Pacific only constructed 690 miles, and the two railroads meeting at Promontory Point, Utah in May of 1869. The directors of the Central Pacific Railroad, you see the four that I've listed on the board, on the slide. Leland Stanford, he's going to become governor of California, the founder of Stanford University. Mark Hopkins, Charles Crocker, Collis Huntington. These are known as the Big Four, and they are going to be financial tycoons. They use the money generated from the railroad and the construction of the railroad to then invest in other areas, expand their holdings and empire, not only in railroads, but other goods and services as well. And so they become the entrepreneurs, the captains of industry of their day. Now, there's always, whenever government money's involved with a project of this nature and of this scope, there's always going to be corruption surrounding it. The Central Pacific is the parent company that gets the loans from the government, but they farm out, they subcontract to other businesses. And one of the businesses they hire is the Credit Finance Corporation. And the Credit Finance Corporation is the company who does the construction. And in studying the records of the Credit Finance Corporation, the Big Four here, in essence, built the government for $79 million in construction cost that only, it's estimated, cost $36 million. So they made quite the profit off of the construction of the Central Pacific. The Union Pacific was no different. Under the head of Oliver Ames and his brother Oak Ames, those are the heads of the Union Pacific, but the real guiding force of the Union Pacific, and if you've watched Hell on Wheels, you know that Thomas Durant was the real guiding force. He's the one who charted the course. He's the one who directed the day-to-day operations. In many ways a genius, and in other ways a real scoundrel. He was, you see I have Dr. Thomas Durant on the slide. He was a medical doctor. And a brilliant physician and, as it turns out, entrepreneur. And as with the Central Pacific, there's going to be corruption surrounding the Union Pacific. Specifically, the Crédit Mobilier scandal. The Crédit Mobilier Company was the company that did most of the construction. It watered down its stock. It charged the government $94 million for construction that only cost about $44 million. As one author says, the Union Pacific bought congressmen like sacks of potatoes to get their way. So corruption surrounds it, but nonetheless, the construction of the railroad went ahead. And in this romanticized painting called The Last Spike by Thomas Hill, painted in 1881, of the meeting at Promontory Point, it romanticizes, and you can see Leland Stanford in the middle, but they drove the golden spike. And here's the pictures of the event, not a painting, but the pictures of the two engines, the Jupiter, as I put on each one, you see the Jupiter in a modern reconstruction of the Jupiter, and then the engine number 610 or something like that. It had a number for the Central Pacific. It didn't have a catchy name. But the two of them meet at Promontory Point on May 10th, 1869, just north of the Great Salt Lake. And the first transcontinental railroad had been constructed. It's going to be followed by many more railroads. 5 altogether. The Central Pacific and Union Pacific, beginning in Omaha and Sacramento and meeting in Utah. But that will soon be followed by the Southern Pacific Railroad, connecting New Orleans to Los Angeles. A branch that uses part of the Southern Pacific but ties the heartland into the Southern Pacific, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe. Goes from Kansas, Atchison, Kansas, and Topeka, Kansas, to ultimately Los Angeles, California. It ties in to the Southern Pacific and goes on to Los Angeles. And then the Northern Pacific, originating ultimately in Chicago to Seattle. And then the Great Northern being the exception of the transcontinental railroads. It was privately built by James J. Hill, using his personal fortune to construct it, wanting to stay out of government control and government imposition of new laws, hoping that he could keep out of that, constructed the Great Northern Railroad from St. Paul, Minnesota to Seattle and ultimately to Portland, Oregon. And so you have these massive construction projects that link the nation east and west. Now, what is the impact of these transcontinental railroads? Well, first off, you have massive migrations of peoples. Irish primarily constructing the Union Pacific, Chinese coming in to construct the Central Pacific, and the waves of immigrants and their families flooding in to build these railroads and then staying on as citizens. And the social implication of that. California is going to endure periodic anti-Chinese riots over the next 20, 30, 40 years. Angry about the arrival of Chinese into the United States. The Irish are yet the latest wave of immigrants coming from Europe, flooding in to fill the ranks of the Union Pacific, as they had, by the way, before filled the ranks of the Union Army. Citizenship being offered right as the Irish came off the boat and thrown right into regiments to fight, many not even speaking English, thrown in to fight the Confederacy. So you have the social impact of all of these immigrants. But going beyond, what does a transcontinental railroad do for you? Well, it ties the nation together financially, economically, and commercially. I said at the beginning, this is the beginnings of a mass consumption economy. Orders can go from California to New York, and now the goods can be shipped. But notice something else. In the original piece of legislation, notice in the official title, an act to aid in the construction of a railroad and telegraph line. So this not only ties the nation together via rail, but through communication. And so it's a long way toward instant communication as the telegraph enables business to send orders over long distance. News now ties the nation together. What happens in Washington, D.C. can be in Los Angeles by the end of the day. Beyond that, don't just think about national news, but national sports. We think nothing of the Texas Rangers playing the Los Angeles Angels or Anaheim Angels or whatever they're called this week. But you get national sports, national boxing figures. They even tried national tennis games, tennis matches. But the scores can be relayed. The creation, if you will, of an economy based on purchasing of things. The rise of the catalog order stores. Montgomery Ward's, Marshall Field's, Sears and Roebuck, J.C. Penney's. They're able to put out catalogs. And in those catalogs, you can see things and order those things, and they will be shipped to your doorstep, practically, by the railroads. The money unleashed by the railroad. The railroads are not only a producer of goods, transporting those goods back and forth, they become a consumer of goods. Think about the wood, the steel, the fabric, all of the things that go into the construction of the trains and the railroads on which they travel. This dramatically transforms America as a society. And that will be the subject of future lectures.